I am so glad that you're here. And Lenny came in this morning. We were just talking just a minute ago, and of course, he said, it's a beginning. And he was talking about the lectureship because it's been a while since it's been held as a state lectureship, and so it's like, well, not many people came. Well, a couple of things entered into that. Number one, it is new again. Number two, Paul was having so much trouble about being able to get the word out and get it advertised and things of that nature. So those things will take care of itself, and as time goes on, it will build into what will edify a lot more people. I love that word that Stephen used, edify, build up, build up a lot more people. So appreciate your being here. Um, I, I was asked a couple of days ago if I would MC, and agreed to do that. I didn't know when I first agreed that Paul was on the schedule to speak, and so I saw that. So last night when I got home after the lectures, I told my wife, I said, "Well, I need to sit down and think about a lesson for tomorrow, because it's on the subject of marriage and divorce." Well, I preached on marriage and divorce a lot, so that's not that hard as far as that's concerned. But I just tried to think about what I might have time to do here in the way that I want. And the topic is really about remarriage, but I want to touch something more than that. If it were in front of a non-believing audience, I would present this differently. But in front of a believing audience, I think there are some things that we need to meet. So let's talk first of all. I've just got a group of lists here that I've made about different things for this. First of all, God's purposes for marriage. And God does list some purposes for marriage. In Genesis 2 and verse 18, he talked about the fact that it was not good for man to be alone. He was going to make a helper for him. And so he took a bone from Adam's rib and gave it, from that made a woman. And because man needed a helper, nothing else in creation was going to be able to fit that. And that word helper is exactly what it is. We've played on this idea a lot. God saw what he made, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And all of a sudden, it's very good. God's a big advocate of completeness. Have you noticed that through the Scripture about all kinds of things? Man and woman, that makes a complete thing. And I know that that's unfortunately not being done in a lot of places anymore as far as making it what it needs to be. It's still the case that man needed a helper. Second reason I've got is for procreation. Be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. God wants procreation. I almost think, and it's just personal opinion, I can't necessarily put any truth to it, except maybe for this passage here in Genesis 1, 27, 28, where we are to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Birth control and prosperity and man's natural selfishness has caused us to say, I don't think we want any kids. Because we want to travel, we want to seed our careers, we want to do this or that or the other, and that's going to cost money, and I'm not sure how pleasing that is to our Lord. So one of the purposes that God made for procreation, for marriage, is procreation. And by the way, when you are married and you finally get old, you need 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 kids to take care of you, so that they can share the burden of that. And those that are single children, or maybe 1 or 2, they understand that burden as parents get old, because we do get old. We all get old, and we require care. So procreation's a great reason. And then there's that companionship. 2 are better than 1. We can just accomplish more when we have a partner. And in the case of marriage, that partner is our mate. And there's so much more that we can do. Let's face it, a couple raises kids better than a dad or better than a mother as far as being by themselves. They accomplish the things of being able both to take care of the living and take care of the home. They're able to do that because they work together for that, because 2 are better than 1. And one's fall down, their partner picks them up. That's the way God intended it. And I know he doesn't really relate that in regard to marriage in Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 9 there, but it does relate to marriage as well as every other thing that it might. Fourth thing that I've listed here, and there are probably other things, the fourth thing that I've listed is for sexual fulfillment. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 2, to avoid fornication. And so God's purposes for marriage are important, and when we marry, we need to be thinking about what we need to do. Now, God has some laws for marriage. Actually, quite a few of them. I've got a pretty good list here of things. Might not be able to go through all of them. But first law is one man, one woman for life. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. And that's not one man with one man, or one woman with one woman. It's one man with one woman. And to leave his father and his mother, to go and cleave unto his wife, to make a separate home for them. Second thing that I've got down is that man is to be the head of the house. Isn't it interesting that we've almost, I don't know, is the right word to say, misunderstood what that headship means? The headship is not, I'm the head of the house and you're going to obey what I say. Is that true? Yeah. But it's not intended to be manifested in that way. Husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Now, in the verses preceding that, in verses 21 and 22, the wife is to submit to the husband. But if the husband loves the wife as Christ loved the church, do you know that Christ has never asked a member of his church, therefore a member of his bride, Christ has never asked a member of his bride to do anything that was not good for them, spiritually, physically, emotionally, intellectually. So I got to tell you, telling my wife to get me a glass of water is not good for her necessarily, spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, in any way. So I wouldn't give that command if I love my wife as Christ loved the church. On the other hand, what an example, 1 Peter chapter 3, where wives are to submit to their husbands as Sarah submitted to Abraham, calling him Lord. It's not the word Lord that's involved there. It's the respect for the position that the husband occupies. And as the husband occupies the right position, so that their prayers be not hindered, that's what you're looking at there in 1 Peter 3, verses 6 and 7, so that their prayers be not hindered, then the wife wants to do that. You know, there's a difference in men and women. It just is. And I know we've tried to do away with that difference. Feminism has tried to bring men to the forefront, and we can do everything that a man can do, and all of that sort of thing. And even if there is an occasional woman that seems to be able to do everything that a man can do, it's not intended for her to do that in the mind of God. So, calling him Lord is leaning on that person for the things that are needed. If I'm the right kind of man, I want her to lean on me. If she's the right kind of woman, she wants to lean on me. And you know what that makes us? That makes us a team, because she's building me up to be what I need to be, and I'm holding her up to be what she needs to be. That's just one of the laws of God's marriage. Another law, and this is why I say, I'm speaking to a group of Christians. I think this is an important one. A child of God is to be married to a child of God. That's been a biblical concept since the very beginning. Now, I'm not saying that man has obeyed it or has done what they needed to do. Matter of fact, I kind of made a list of places where that wasn't done. We see a problem with that in Exodus 34. We see a problem with that in Joshua 23. We see a problem with that in Ezra 9:1, a problem with it in Ezra 10:3, a problem with it in Nehemiah 13, a problem with it in the life of Solomon. What happened? All of these people, all these circumstances, were people married outside of the Lord. Somebody says, well, they married outside of their race. That wasn't the point. The point is not about race, and there's only one race anyway, that's the human race, just different colors in that human race, different facial expressions, different all kinds of things, but one race. He wanted us to marry people who would help get us to heaven. He wants me to marry someone that I can help get to heaven. And so he laid out that law. Don't marry the Canaanites. Why not? Because they'll tear your heart away. We've ignored that law. As a matter of fact, we said it's not a law. We've looked at it and not considered it. That's why we have such a furor of discussion over 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 39, because we don't want it to be a law. So let's start arguing about it, and we can just argue endlessly and say, well, we just can't figure out whether he means there in the Lord to be a Christian or not a Christian. By the way, I can't see a difference there. Somebody says you should marry someone that is marriageable. Well, for the Christian, someone that's marriageable is another Christian. Or you should marry in the Lord someone who is a Christian, which doesn't mean, well, it means both. And our marriages would be better if we did that. Appreciate John when he spoke about our young people. Was that Sunday night, I guess? On Sunday night, he emphasized that importance of a Christian marrying a Christian. And that's one of the laws that God laid down. Now, we'll talk about in a minute God's laws about divorce and remarriage. But I want us to see that there are some laws that God laid down, which if we fulfill, our part as a woman, our part as a man, and our willingness to follow what God said, we don't have quite the same problems that we may have otherwise. But I want to spend a little bit of time on this idea of selecting a mate, just because I think young people, for sure, don't think about this as they go into a marriage. And so parents and grandparents should be leading them in this all the time that they're growing up. This should be some of the thoughts. Think about these things. When you marry, your mate and you, first of all, are going to decide how much money to give to the Lord. Think about that problem if the mate is not a Christian, not a faithful Christian. Think about that. How much of the money that you bring home as the head of the house are you going to give to the Lord? And by the way, disagreement over money, that's a big deal in marriage. That's why many couples have separate accounts. She works and has her account. He works and has his account. The truth is, all the money in the marriage belongs to both of them, which is overseen by the husband out of the greatest consideration for what others need. By the way, that's a biblical principle. Look at every man on his own things. Look at every man on things. How much more should that apply to your mate than it does anyone else? But you're also going to discuss what movies, what TV programs are we going to watch during our recreation? Or are we even going to watch any? How many of them are we going to watch? What is the character of them going to be? Now, that's going to be decided in a marriage. If you marry a Christian, and the Christian is trying to be like Jesus, 1 Peter 1, 21, 22, you know we're supposed to be like Jesus, or 2, excuse me, then that's easy. That's an easy thing. How about this? The reading material in your home. I know that reading's kind of fallen on bad times. We're much more likely to be scrolling than we are reading. That's kind of unfortunate in a way. But I think of the magazines. I mean, back, I don't know, when I was growing up, people who came into a store would still complain about what picture was on the magazine if it was not decent, because their kids were coming by it. And they didn't want that. I don't know that anybody complains about that anymore. But, you know, is our house full of romance novels? Is it full of westerns that have filthy language in it? Is it full of magazines that every page is a picture because that's what gathers our attention? And is it full of, I get a car magazine. I can go to Napa. This is absolutely true. I was big on car things and stuff like that at one time. And I started thumbing through a Napa sales catalog. They're selling tools. They're selling parts. And every third or fourth page got a naked woman on it, or about as naked as you can get and still put it in the magazine, Why? Sex sells. Well, is that the kind of material that I want in my house? See, if I marry a Christian, that becomes an easier question to deal with. How about where we're going to worship? If we're not the same faith, and I'm talking about the Lord's faith now, if we're not the same faith, are we going to go to different churches? Are we going to trade about? Go there this time and there that time? Are we going to go our separate ways? And therefore never be united on a cause for the Lord. What about children? What clothes are the children going to wear? What companions are we going to agree that they should have? How much freedom to do their own thing are we going to give them as they grow up and they become teenagers and so forth? What is going to be the most important education that happens in our house? I mean, is it going to be more important on a Wednesday night or a Sunday, even a Sunday morning? Is it going to be more important that they do their paper for school that they hadn't done yet? Or more important that they worship God? Those are all questions that come up in a marriage. Not a problem. Well, I won't say it's never a problem if you marry a Christian, but if you marry a faithful Christian, it's a problem that can always be worked out in a way that pleases God. Man, what an important concept that is. All right, let's talk because we don't have a great deal of time. Let's talk about marriage and divorce. I think Brother Larry, we were talking about it a little early. I said, well, it's going to be kind of abbreviated. He said, well, it's simple. He said, just tell them to read Matthew 19. I've not as much as Stephen has, perhaps, but I have studied Greek a lot. I had 6 years of it in college altogether. That's why I know nothing about it. It's just confusing, and I've heard a number of symposiums just based on the language of Matthew 19 and other passages in Scripture. And you know what I've learned? The English says it as well as it can be said. Now, I don't know if that's true in a French translation or a Russian translation or whatever, whether their language is the same, but when I study the English translations, it says it. So I've gotten to where when I'm studying with people, and I know that there's a problem in that marriage, somewhere in the course of that study, I say, by the way, there's something I want you to read when you go home. And I'll slip over to them, passages like Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 and 1 Corinthians 7. I'll slip some. I said, I want you to come back and tell me what you think about them. And I know you're going to find this hard to believe, and I've only been doing this about 56 years, so there may be some circumstances that would be different. I have never had anyone come back with the wrong understanding of what God says about marriage. Now, I've had a number that says we're not going to do that. I mean, there have been enough. But I've never had anyone that misunderstood what God teaches about marriage and divorce. Our Bible lessons, think about it, the open Bible study, the Search the Scriptures study, the Back to the Bible study, and things that have been printed by brethren over the years, they're all based on the idea that what we're going to do is have that person read the Scripture and tell us what it says, and we just mark it on the paper. That's what they get out of it. And you know what? They always get the truth. Well, that's true in regard to marriage and divorce as well. So let's touch on what Jesus says. And since the biggest passage concerning that is Matthew 19, let's spend a little time there. You know how the question came up. I mean, They had Shammai and Hillel, and these two different opinions about what God said about marriage in the Old Testament. That's what the Jews were arguing about. Did that mean a sexual misconduct, or did that just mean you didn't have to like it? The word uncleanness, that's the word that they were having problems with. And so these Jews approach Jesus with that implied question. Jesus knows exactly what they're talking about, and he goes back. He goes back in front of Hillel. He goes back in front of Shammai, and he goes back in front of Moses. He goes all the way to creation. I don't know fully what he meant when he said, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, gave you right of divorcement. And by the way, that was not a command of divorcement. That was a writing, a right to give a writing of divorcement. He didn't command them to do that. But he just goes back and he says, now Moses did that because of your heart and your heart, but it wasn't always the case. From the beginning, it was not so. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. How long was that going to last? Well, that's going to last until death. 1 Corinthians 7 in verse 2, that a woman is bound to her husband by the law of her husband so long as he lives. What is it? One man, one woman for life. So Jesus says, but I say unto you, that kind of puts a period on it. You've heard it said, but I say unto you. You've heard it said. He did that all the way through the 5th chapter of the book of Matthew. So here he says, I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for the cause of fornication, shall marry another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her that is put away commits adultery. That's just not hard to understand. Jesus is saying, and by the way, God knows divorce is going to occur, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 13 through 15. He's aware divorce is going to occur. Let not the wife depart from the husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. He didn't say she couldn't be faithful to him if she was unmarried. Obviously, she wouldn't be as complete as she was when she was married, but she could still be faithful. But she couldn't be faithful and marry another. If she's going to be reconciled, she's got to be reconciled to her husband unless she divorced him for fornication. He divorced her for fornication. Now, there might be some question about fornication. But basically, that's illicit sex. I think bestiality falls into that category. I think homosexuality falls into that category. And I think fornication with a person of the opposite sex falls into that category. To be honest with you, well, we don't have time to get into all that detail. I think there's a lot that falls into that category that maybe we don't consider. But your mate has committed fornication. You have the right, not the obligation. I did a lot of counseling for a lot of years. Try to stay away from that completely now because I found out I wasn't all that smart. I try to keep people together. That's God's plan. The whole point about this idea of fornication, it's not about, you had sex with somebody else. I mean, don't misunderstand. That's what it is. It's about the fact that you broke a trust. That's where it's at. Your child's growing up. And something happens. And you ask the child, did you do this? No, Mama, I didn't do it. Mama, I didn't do it. I think you did. No, Mama, I didn't do it. And okay, so I lost this shirt one time. Brand new shirt. Now, back then, we didn't have much money, so a brand new shirt, that was a big deal. It was expected to, I was growing, so it wasn't going to last forever, but it was expected to last at least a year when I was at school. So I had this shirt, and one day it didn't show up. Mom said, you're not wearing that new shirt I bought you. Oh, I left it at school. Kind of strange, I didn't come home shirtless, but anyway, that's the lie I told. I left it at school. What I had done is I love to read. And they wanted me to go to bed at a certain time. So I'd get under my cover with the lamp. I didn't have a flashlight back in those days. And so I had the lamp. Incandescent lights, you know how hot they get? Anyway, I put my shirt over that lamp, and I was reading under it. And the shirt was burning. So I shut it off, of course, obviously pretty quick, and I took that shirt. And we had what they called cubby holes back then. It's kind of like little storage places that are between the rafters, and you have a little hole to crawl back in there to do whatever you needed to do. And I threw that in the back. Mom, first of all, it's two-story. Mom never came upstairs, and she certainly never crawled into a cubby hole, but 6 years later she did. I don't know why she did. All I know is I came home, and my shirt was laying on the table. Oh, boy. I was in trouble. But you know what that changed? Every time I said something after that, there was a suspicion, was I lying about it? Because I lied to her. And I lied to her again and again and again, and for years. Well, that's what happens when you commit fornication. You break a trust, and some people can live together and patch that up, and they can get through it. It's not easy. But some people can't live with that when they've been cheated about, and God permits them to get a divorce and to remarry. You see, every covenant is a covenant between three. Every marriage covenant is between three. It's between the man and the woman. It's between the woman and God, and it's between the man and God. Kind of like a triangle, of a covenant. Here's the man and the woman down here, and they've tied together. And when one of them commits fornication, God permits that bond to be broken, and he permits this other bond between the man or the woman and him and the woman, or him and the man, whichever it is. He breaks that bond, but this other one over here, he doesn't release that one. And so the person cannot marry. But the person who had fornication committed against them could. Or they could, and this is the hope, they could be reconciled to their own husband, as 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is talking about. Now, let's go back to Matthew 19 for a minute. Whosoever shall put away his wife, except for fornication, and shall marry another, commits adultery. We have this thing in the church that's come to be called the waiting game. Now, I want to tell you right off the bat, the whole concept of the waiting game is like a way of saying, I can get around what God says. I can do it this way. I remember when a group called a cappella, and there might be a lot of groups called that now, but back years ago, and I'm talking about back in the 70s, when a group called a cappella first formed, it was a group that would sing commercially songs without instruments. But I happened to be in the congregation where they were formed. And their reasoning was, I was a brand new preacher. It was my first year. And their reasoning was, we found a way to get around what God said about instrumental music. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to get around what God said? And they started doing it by, they would make the instrument sounds with their voices and with their hands and with their tongue and so forth. Well, I think some people are wanting to do that also with marriage. And so we can divorce, but it's not for fornication. And now I can wait until this person commits adultery, and now I can put them away for fornication. You can read the language. I don't understand the language that way. The divorce needs to be for fornication. That's what I understand the Bible to say about that. And it doesn't say, now you can wait for 5 years or 10 years. I had a young preacher sitting in my house one day, and he'd come by, and he was talking about that, and he and his wife has just gotten a divorce. Here's what he said. He said, but that's okay. I know she's going to find somebody to remarry, and then I can put her away. I said, oh, no, you can't. You've already done that. One man, one woman for life, except it be for fornication. If it's not for fornication, neither of them can get married for the rest of their lives, unless one dies. I know that we've decided to ignore that. Matter of fact, I understand. I'm not sure how true this is, but I understand that probably about half or more of our preaching brethren have taught that what we call, and I don't like that term, you understand there's a difference in the waiting game, that mentality that says, I'm going to find a way around what God says. There's a difference in that and the person who seriously understands that the timing of the divorce cannot be the civil ceremony because we can't break up what God's put together, and therefore it's a spiritual event that happens later on. I think I can defend that differently so that it is the civil divorce that occurs that marks the end of that marriage, and that for fornication. Because when I read Matthew 19:9, it's just, that's what it says. And I don't, by the way, I think I can support that from the Greek too, but I don't need the Greek to do that. I think the English adequately teaches what God says about marriage and divorce. I've always been, I want you to think about this. I've always been amazed. Had a man, well, I can't say I've always been amazed, but from the first year I preached, I was amazed at this. A man came to me, he was restored. Didn't know him. Nobody in the congregation knew him. He came forward one day and he said, I've been a Christian for X number of years, a lot of years. And he said, no, I've been faithful, I want to be. So we did. He became a very active member. He had 8 kids. His wife's name was Thelma, dear woman. We finally did convert her as well. And then I find out, he comes to me and says, I got a question to ask you. He said, Mike, this is my 3rd marriage. And I'm like, surely you jest. No, this is my 3rd marriage. And he said, the first 2, one of them lasted for 2 weeks, one of them lasted for 6 months. I said, was fornication involved in either of them? He said, no, we just realized we shouldn't have been married. And then he'd been married to this last one for, I think at that time it was like 28 years. And I won't tell you, I was 19 years old. That was my first full-time work. I knew nothing. I especially knew nothing about marriage. I wasn't even married myself yet, let alone to know anything about it. So I wrote a bunch of people. People whose names you would know. And it came back exactly what I understood, but, they explained it in the Greek and they explained it in the English grammar, and they looked all over other places in the Bible that I didn't even know to look at that time. So I went back to John and I said, John, if I understand this right, you're living in adultery, and you and Thelma are going to have to separate. Now I want to tell you, there was a lot more to it than that, because he had land. The church, the congregation, offered to help him build a house that he could stay in separate, still be with the kids, but not be with her, etc., things like that. But here's what he said. He said, if that's the kind of God that I serve, it's not one that I want to serve. And I said, John, regardless of whether I'm right or you're right or whatever's right, your attitude is not right. Because here's what he's saying. He's saying, I got married, and I wanted to break it up. That was okay. I got married again, and I wanted to break it up. That was okay. I got married again, and God says I need to break it up, and all of a sudden that's not okay. It's okay for me to do what I want, but it's not okay to do what God wants. That's exactly what that attitude says when we're looking at it. The person who's been divorced, it's like, I did that, and that's okay. I mean, that was the wise thing to do under those circumstances. But now when God says, this will get you to heaven, that's not okay. So it's kind of arrogant, isn't it? You know, like, I've got a better understanding of what life was like here on this earth and how difficult this is than even God has. You know, I could go on. I had an opportunity one time to speak on a panel, and we had 9 hours of discussion on this subject, and we covered everything. Isn't it amazing that we can talk for so long about what God covered in 4 or 5 verses? And we can try to say, wonder what he meant there. Well, he meant what he said. Here's what God said: one man, one woman for life. If you divorce not for fornication, you don't have a right to remarry except to each other. If you divorce for fornication, the innocent party has the right to remarry someone else. By the way, if those two people are a Christian, they have the right to remarry a Christian. But they were supposed to marry in the first place if they were Christians. I mean, everybody should do that. You know, somebody says, well, the law to marry a Christian can't apply to the non-Christian. Yes, it can. Let me ask you this. Does the law, it's interesting the way this works. Does the law to partake of the Lord's Supper apply to people in the world? Absolutely. It's a sin when they don't take the Lord's Supper. Now, do they have to qualify for it first? Yes, they need to be a Christian. They need to be a Christian. One of the things that came out years ago on the subject of divorce and remarriage was the scope of the covenants that said, well, people in the world are not amenable to God's law on divorce and remarriage. Well, what are they amenable? Only the law of baptism. That's the only. Well, listen, if they're not amenable to any other law, they have no sin. If they have no sin, the law of baptism means nothing to them. That's really what the scope of the covenant thing was that was put out by James Bales many, many years ago. Every person on earth is amenable to every law of God if they fit in that category. And by that category, I mean, obviously, God has different laws for wives. Not any man can be a wife. He has different laws for husbands. But every husband in the world is under the same laws of God. Every wife in the world is under the same law of God. So yes, are there prerequisites? That's true. If you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has aught against you, Matthew 5, 23 and 24, leave there thy gift and go and be reconciled. What's the prerequisite to worshiping God? Getting rid of sin. That's prerequisite. Are you required to worship? Yes. But in order for your worship to be acceptable, you have to get rid of sin. That's right. But it doesn't change the fact that every single person in the world is required to worship. Every person in the world is required to marry a Christian because every person in the world is required to be a Christian. That's hard for us to think about. Yes, they have the choice because God gives us the power of choice. I don't like the word. It's just me. It's just, yeah, I know. I'm going to have to quit here. I don't like the phrase free will. Because in judgment, we're going to find out that our will is not free. It's going to cost us. Power of choice, yes. He does give us the power of choice. But he doesn't give us freedom of choice. He says, choose me or else. That's the biblical concept. So I talk about the power of choice, but I don't ever talk about the freedom of choice. Because that might leave somebody with the idea that they can do what they want. And just in all honesty, we can't do what we want. I've actually got 4 pages of notes here that I could go over, list, so to speak. But what I said kind of covers what God said. Because he said it in 4 or 5 verses, and I've taken 45 minutes to say what he said in a couple. This is an important topic. Marriage. I mean, 2 institutions, marriage, the church, the only 2 institutions that God had a hand in, and the 2 institutions, by the way, that make the entire difference of what way the world goes. We say, as the home goes, so goes the church. Listen, as the home goes, so goes the world. Think about that. That's really the way it is. Every time we choose to ignore some command of God, like God's law on divorce and remarriage, especially God's law on divorce and remarriage, we're saying that God doesn't have to have our respect. We're saying that in some way we're smarter than God, or we deserve the right to do something different than what God says. We can do something different than what God says. We don't have that right. And we don't have that freedom. And one day we pay for that. Let us, in the church, first of all, let's stop being afraid to say that a Christian must marry a Christian. Somebody says, well, if that were the case, my wife would never have been a Christian, or my husband would never have been a Christian. Yeah, but for every one that has been converted by their mate, there were 21 of us in my youth group when I grew up in the church. And I did, by the way, grow up in the church. 21 in that youth group. 20 of them married outside the Lord, and 20 of them have not darkened the door of the Lord's church now for years. The last one left the Lord's church about 30 years ago, because I kept track of them. For every one that was converted. And I'm thankful for that, by the way. I'm thankful that they're converted. But if we would start converting a lot more people, so we have lots of kids for our children to choose from, we wouldn't have to worry about this idea of marrying outside the Lord. We'd have kids for them to choose. You know why I sent my kids to a Christian college? I mean, it didn't work at the Christian college. I didn't send them there for an education. Man, I can get them education anywhere. I sent them there to get a mate. I made no bones about that. Why? Because it's just a bunch of Christians to choose from. Do you know why we like youth meetings? Because our Christians get to meet other Christians in their general vicinity, kind of in their general state. That's a good thing. Let's just honor God's law, not just about divorce and remarriage, but about marriage and about the home. Thank you.